Welcome back to the Writing Craft Podcast, guys. I am your host, Jenna.
And I'm your host, Holly.
And today we're talking about writing everything believable, witchcraft, cults, pagan, all of those different subsections of things.
Because sometimes when you are writing, it can be a bit difficult determining your own religion or cult, and we just want to get into that a little bit today, as I think we both have experience doing this a little bit, or a lot.
And I think, too, when you're talking about, our podcast specifically, we both do very witchy things. I myself am pagan, so going and writing and reading a lot of things that take from cultures and practices that I partake in, my friends partake in, and seeing them wrong or not respected very nicely is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, and so definitely wanted to bring that into the forefront of this episode as well.
Absolutely. And that's one of the main things I think of whenever I think about writing believable stuff like this, because there are so many times that I've watched something. I've gone on TV. It's like, all right, I'm going to watch this cool, witchy thing or dark series. And then they bring in the Wiccans and they get it totally wrong so many times. And the second that occurs, I'm just sitting there like, could you not just read? Could you not just do some research? It's not hard. It's really, really not.
I get that way every single time that someone goes and decides to make the Satanist cult is the bad guy. And I'm not even Satanist, and I still get can you do even just the tiniest bit of research beforehand? And it frustrates me to no end, because it's like, you're bringing in a lot of, those influences come from the Satanic Panic way back, in the freaking 80s, 90s, etc. And it all it does is do the same exact thing over again, where it causes this, oh no, Satanist cults are, worshiping the devil and, sacrificing babies. And that's someone's actual religion. If we were going to do the same exact thing with Christianity or any other larger religion today, then it would be a whole different conversation. But because it's Satanists, or because it's pagan, or because it's a dead religion, even though it's not, that gets ignored, and you're told to just deal with all of the negative stereotypes.
And I think that's where information comes in handy, right? Because something like Satanism, people hear that and their gut reaction is, Satan in the biblical context. Whereas one of the things that you'll learn if you research religions is the way they're formed and the way people come together and how they become something. And Satanism isn't quite rooted in that. Like if you read the Satanic Bible, which is where a lot of that, became a solid thing, it's about self-worship. And a lot of people who are Satanists don't even believe in the devil as an actual figure. So if you do your research, you go, oh, that's what this word actually means to the people who actually practice it. And that's a great example too, because I know there's the Church of Satan and then there's the Temple of, or I can't remember. There's two different ones, and there was the LaVey one, and then there's a newer one now, which is really just about inclusivity and stuff. And you would learn that and be able to speak about it properly if you just do the smallest bit of research. It's not a lot.
Well, I think too, this is where a lot of authors and creative people who are creating any sort of story, whether it's movies, TV shows, or books, they get inspiration from other media, and it's great to get inspiration from other things. I'm always a proponent of, if you're feeling burnt out, if you're not feeling creative, consume other art. However, we also fall into the trap of copy pasting negative stereotypes. And I mean, this is how we have, goblins as a stereotype for Jewish people, and sometimes people don't even freaking know that that's what they're writing. And there's just a plethora of other examples of that same exact thing copy and pasted over, because you're not critically thinking about where some of these tropes or some of these different negative stereotypes we have with fantastical creatures, with cults, with religions. And if you don't understand the origins of something, you copy paste it from a medium that you enjoy, you might not realize that you're copy pasting something that is not good representation.
And you're gonna have a better work if you have a level of originality and authenticity, right? Because you might get inspired. Let's say you watch like the Blair Witch Project, and you're like, that's my witch. Uh, well, like do some research and figure out a better way to do that rather than just doing that same thing again. Because whether I don't know, even if your inspiration was accurate, like more accurate, then you still don't want to be, like you said, copying and pasting what someone else is doing. So I think that's just it's such a good rule of thumb in general. If like it's good to be inspired, and you can totally take elements from things that you love, but always do your research because it's just, it's going to be kind of a not good imitation in the end, and maybe not even accurate because you can't necessarily trust that other person did their research, even if you love what they did.
Yeah, one of the things I always go back to is when people base like an elemental magic system and they will comp it to like Avatar: The Last Airbender. And Avatar: The Last Airbender took a lot from Asian cultures and indigenous cultures, but their research was just a subsurface level of everything. And so if you actually decided, okay, I'm going to write something elemental based off of Avatar: The Last Airbender and inspired by that, I'm going to use that as a comp. And then you also decide, I'm going to base it off of Asian cultures. Okay, well, if you actually look at some of the, actual elemental type of, quote unquote magic systems, belief systems, etc., that a lot of Asian cultures focus on, they actually have like metal as an element and different things like that that are not those water, earth, fire, air. And we don't see those used as often solely because people are copy pasting what they learned from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And then it gives you a whole wide berth of new inspiration points when you actually look at the original, concept, the original, starting point of all these different belief systems, religions, cults. Like if you look at the source material, you're not getting the filtered out version that someone else decided to cook up for their own version of things. And that's where I usually see people's world building fall apart, is because they're pulling things. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of Avatar: The Last Airbender's magic system. I'm going to combine it with a little bit of this Norse paganism I heard about from Marvel, and then just put it together, and here you go. And then all of a sudden we still have the trope of Loki and Thor being brothers. They are not. They they are not. And I blame Marvel for that
Oh yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
yeah. I would as well. I mean, even with Avatar, you had controversy and stuff like that in the adaptation, right? Like I think there was something about fans of the original finding issues with misrepresentation of non-Western cultures and religions. I didn't actually see the adaptation, but I seem to remember something about that.
I think it's because the actor for Sokka was not correctly casted as indigenous, and it's a whole separate conversation about that one. But overall, I think the live action did, a better adaptation of Asian cultures, but not necessarily indigenous cultures, because the majority of the production team was Asian. And I will never go and harp on Asian Americans deciding that they want to represent their culture and doing their best to take on, the indigenous elements from it as well, especially because the original creators of Avatar: The Last Airbender, Bright from the cartoon, they were two white guys and they fucked up religiously, but because we have the filter of nostalgia, where we brush every messed up thing that they have ever done under the rug, and then we're going to go shoot all of the production team from the live action who are actually representing their own cultures in the foot. So I'm not a fan
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's when I just remember hearing little bits of things about it, but I never watched too much of it because it's interesting. There's lots of controversies that come up a lot around things, and I mean sometimes they're well founded, sometimes they're not. Like what was another one? Indiana Jones. like uh the cult performing human sacrifices that are supposed to represent Hindu beliefs, like it's just like, come on guys, really.
Yeah, and I mean that ends up having real world applications. I saw not too long ago that people were saying Satanist statue put in the middle of Dallas or something like that, and it was like it was a Hindu god at a Hindu temple. But you just want to give it a negative stereotype because you think it looks demonic according to your religious beliefs. And I'm like, I
Yeah.
thought, we're supposed to have freedom of religion here, but but I guess not.
Freedom of Christianity.
Yeah, basically. And I mean that's specifically you're Canadian, but one of the things that I learned through taking anthropology classes, as I do, just for because I found a random passion in it, not because it actually yeah, it became fun for me. I always wanted to be an archaeologist. And one of the very first things I learned in my archaeology class, like the first introduction to anthropology as a whole medium, was Indiana Jones is bullshit. If you're taking this class because you want to be like Indiana Jones or the Mummy, you're in the wrong class, because that is not what we do anymore. That is very like 19th to 18th century type of archaeology, is to go and take a bunch of stuff and put it in the British Museum, or put it in your personal collection, and then go and make movies where you negatively represent the cultures that you stole the shit from, because you can take care of it better.
We have a really cool museum here in Montreal. It's on McGill campus, and oh my gosh, getting into history like McGill, that's a whole can of worms. Like there's secret societies and MK Ultra, and we go into it on the Haunted Montreal channel. But there's this museum on the property which is very cool. It's like, you know, night at the museum style, sort of old. It's in like an old bank building. There's skeletons, like dinosaur skeletons and stuff, but a good chunk of stuff in there was taken by the founders of McGill, who were these, you know, like old white guys who traveled to foreign countries and purchased things and brought them back and then donated them to the museum. And now there's a push to have a lot of those items repatriated to their appropriate countries, because it's like, that's kind of not cool.
Yeah, and I mean, it was because of that movement of taking, really cool and artistic and beautiful things from other cultures, and then, during colonialism, as part of it, going and taking their shit and then putting it in our museums and then charging people to be able to go see their own fucking cultures or the cultures of around the world, rather than, like letting their museums in those countries and cultures showcase their things if they choose to, and then they can always loan it for money to other countries to
Which
so
we
everyone
do,
can see.
which we do now, thankfully.
We're starting to.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean that's the whole sort of beginnings of so many different misunderstandings about other cultures, is that other cultures were trying to interpret it. They would have bias through their lens, and that would color the stories that they told about it. That's why we have things like the pagan filth, and that's why we have things about pagans being worshipping Satan and being demonic. And even if we go to like Saint Patrick was worshipped, or for a long time he became a saint, right, in Christian biblical times and everything. And we have literally a holiday to him every single year where everyone dresses up in green, and they don't think about the deeper meaning of why he was venerated. And it was the fact that he took all of the snakes out of Ireland. The snakes were pagan. The snakes were pagans. They weren't like snakes. They were people.
Yeah.
There was genocide against pagan people in Ireland. They're it's a different history entirely, and luckily we have a huge move back to older ancient pagan roots now. But if you're going to go and base any sort of magic system in whatever sort of medium you're creating off of these real religious practices that pagans to this day do, like, you have to know what in the world happened to these people. You have to know the negative bias that you, especially if you're coming from a Christian mindset that you grew up in or that you're still in, how that's going to color your view of the story you're telling.
And you need to look at what the people practicing the religion say about it, what they say their intentions are, because, just because you assume one thing, like, oh, they run around in the woods naked and they have bonfires and stuff, they're worshiping Satan, and it's about and that does happen, but it's not because anyone's, worshiping demons. I mean, I'm sure some people do, but like, there's always those outliers. There's always the demon worshippers somewhere, but like pagans, the main thing I always say to people is it's a nature-based religion. Like it's not dark, it's not evil, it's revolving around nature and around community, and that's a very primary thing within that religion. And maybe it'll look scary to you, but just, look up a journal of someone who's involved in it, look up what they're talking about. You're going to see a whole lot of nature, and it's not that scary.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there's even people who make YouTube or TikTok videos about their experience in, different pagan practices and things like that. And because for so long people were, not treated nicely for following these religious practices of being pagan, of venerating old gods, and it basically was seen to have died off because of the force to convert to one of the Abrahamic religions that dominated Europe. And then we took that belief system over here. We did the same thing to our indigenous population all throughout North and South America. And then, they sort of blended in a lot of different places their original culture and religious beliefs into something a little bit more angelical in nature. We have all of these different types of areas where paganism is kind of also a part of Christianity.
You
And
you can literally find statues, like pagan goddess statues that were then used as statues of Mary in other
yeah,
locations. Yeah.
I mean, there's a huge theory as well that Odin is just Santa Claus, and
Oh yeah,
that's one
yeah.
that I totally believe.
I can see that.
Because you think about Odin,
Odin's
during
coming down my chimney.
well, I mean, Odin would go around in the winter in the darkest, times of the year, and he would ride in his sleigh, by pulled by his wolves, and he would go on the wild hunt. And it's like, oh, and he's got a long white beard, and he's very wise. He knows when you're
Yeah,
sleeping, he knows when you're awake.
I can see that. Somehow, like that's a little bit terrifying, but I also like it.
uh, I find it really, really fun. And that's a basis in the book that I'm writing right now. Is a lot of these different things have influenced the current Viking serial that I'm working on right now, because you have a lot of people who follow the old gods, aka the Norse pantheon, and then you have a new religion coming in that's totally not based on any religion in our history where they started forcibly converting pagans. It totally is not. But it is its own thing at the same time. I created this religion specifically to have a little bit more of a balance between, the pagan pantheon in Norse mythology and their own. And it's not a singular monolithic god system with a singular god either. And that I find oftentimes is what I end up reading. I end up reading that, in this nice fantasy world, there is people who are religious and believe in the one god, and then there's all the people who are the bad guys who believe in a pantheon of evil deities, and it's like that. Just it's so lazy writing, in my opinion, and it upsets me. If it needs to be for your story for certain elements, like, okay, but I've seen it so often that it just gets on my nerves.
Yeah, it's far too common. And I mean, there's what you were saying about, how it's not the religion, but it is the religion. I think that it is important for people to know that, like, because you talk about people getting it wrong. What I always wonder, like one of my things that I wonder when they're getting religions wrong, it's like, why didn't you just make your own? Like there, that is always an option. You can look at elements, you can look at sort of the building blocks of a religion and make your own, so that you are not misrepresenting an existing religion, right? And yeah, that can be the singular god. Obviously, that's always going to signify something. Like people are going to clue into what you might be doing no matter what. But you can do your own thing with religions, which is sort of what we're addressing today. But yeah, you have to do it right. You have to follow the right steps.
And I mean, that's the crux of what I find is usually the issue is just sheer laziness, because a lot of writers do not like world building. I find oftentimes there's the camp of people who are obsessed with world building, but they'll get into the issue where they just world build, world build, world build. They'll create their own plot holes, or they'll just never start writing the book. Right. And I used to fall into that camp way too often, where I would just build this huge world and then never go and play in it by actually writing the book. And I quickly realized that that's not sustainable, and that I will write the world more accurately by having lived in the world, by actually writing the book.
Yeah,
And then I'll
I do
find the
that. I
connections.
do them in tandem as well. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I basically try to find out as much as I need to know to just understand the world, to be able to get my foot in the door, and then I'll start running with it, and it'll build on itself as I'm writing the story, and then the plot starts to get created alongside the world, and they balance each other out. Versus Yeah, and then versus the other people who are like, I hate world building with my entire being, and I don't want to do it. So then they just go, they prayed at the table with their hands clasped together to the singular, wonderful God who sees all. and their name was Fadupadoo. Like,
Yeah. It's like, we know what you're doing. We all know what you're doing here.
yeah. And I mean, you know, if it's not a central part of your story or if it's just something super minor, sure, like you don't have to do these things. But then also, I would raise the question of then do you need a religion in your world at all? Is it completely possible for you to just say that there is no religious connotations or religions in your book and they just say the gods? Like it would be really just brief. You don't have to go into it. But the act of just being lazy with it is what frustrates me. Like when I hear that I'm going to read this giant fantasy world book, I'm expecting to get some serious world building with it. And when people get lazy on the world building, and specifically with the religions, and they go based off of, you know, biases and different negative stereotypes, and then they think that that is somehow world building, then I get frustrated.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I don't know, you can address stereotypes and stuff. Like you can use certain things and you can talk about how the stereotypes are bad. You could do that. Like that's something fun and creative to do. Maybe call it out.
That's one of my favorite things to do, is to kind of just take something that would otherwise be seen as very, you know, stereotypical stance or, you know, negative kind of connotated thing, and then turn it on its head some way. I do enjoy actively doing that in some of my like my work, and it really just depends on the project. But you can't really flip something on its head, just like you can't break the rules until you know the rules. You can't go and break the stereotype until you know what it is. You can't go and change, you know, people's perception of something if you don't even understand your own perception of the thing.
Yeah. And the thing with religions, if you're working on making one for your story that isn't, you know, a carbon copy of something that already exists, and you might be risking offending people who practice that, like there are definitely building blocks that most religions, I'm not going to say all because I'm not a religion expert, but you know, there are things that you can incorporate and then make it your own sort of thing. Like there's usually a creation myth. There's like something to do with creation. That's where it tends to stem from. You have your like deities or a higher power. There's usually something in there about your morals or your ethics. There's going to be rituals or practices. There's going to be some sort of text. There's usually a book, right? There's going to be symbols and icons. And like, even as I'm going through these sort of building blocks that I've sectioned out for when I work on stuff, like it's just talking about it, I'm like, yeah, this is going to be really fun to fill out. So like, I'm definitely a world builder, but there are formulas that will help you, even if you are like quote unquote lazy or not into world building. Like there really isn't any excuse, right? Because as long as you fill out your sort of basics, you can work from there, and you don't need to be offensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, and that becomes the problem, is that so many people don't understand that they are pulling from a negative stereotype because they're doing the, you know, the quote unquote lazy way. They're just filling out a sheet with things that they have in their head, or they'll do a brief, you know, overview of, oh, I'm basing this story off of some Celtic mythology or some, I wanted to have a setting similar to Outlander. And then they'll go, okay, but I don't really want to do anything like, you know, with, you know, Christianity or anything like that. So let me just pull from like some Celtic stuff. They'll read some stuff on Wikipedia and then they'll just mishmash it together into its own sort of thing and think that that's, you know, world building. But again, if you don't fully understand it, then sometimes it is best to just go and fully make up your own thing versus taking someone else's, and then you run the risk of getting it wrong. And I don't think that, you know, when Stan Lee created, you know, Thor in Marvel, that he was thinking that it was going to have such a rippling effect to the point where modern day Norse pagans have to deal with the, oh, Loki is Thor's brother kind of, you know, kind of thing. And it worked for the purpose of that story, but it got so big that people who now, you know, follow the Norse pagan ways, they have difficulty separating that. And people who actually go and write, you know, stories like my own that are based on Vikings that have the Norse pantheon, we now have to go and reteach people that that is not in the canon.
And people are going to be saying to you, why did you change that? It's like, no, I didn't change that.
Stan Lee changed that.
Yeah. I remember being like much younger, and my dad's in comics, and I remember thinking, why is Thor even in Marvel? Like, what? It was such like, I mean, look, I'm a Loki girl. I love Loki. Loki is my guy, but it's weird. it's weird.
Well, I mean, it was in itself a little bit lazy because he just took from a pantheon that, and I mean, I imagine there's other comics that aren't just based on the Norse. I mean, even in Thor: Love and Thunder, we saw like Zeus and other pantheons and different things like that, and they just made them aliens, which is an interesting concept, but it got so big that it literally rewrote the narrative for so many people on what the hell that those myths mean and what
Well,
they're about.
and I think a lot of people are sure there are people who have a clear intention when they're doing something wrong with a religion, but I think in a lot of cases people are ignorant because they look at something like a pantheon and they don't even assume that people practice this kind of thing anymore. They just go, well, that's fantasy already. Like that's already fantasy, so I can do what I want with it. It's like, well, no, people are still following these old religions. We're out there. We exist, and you may be making it difficult for people to sort of walk through the world when you get it wrong.
Yeah, I think too, that's one of the main things. Even when I'm in my anthropology classes, I will have professors on multiple occasions say that, like, oh, this is a dead religion. It's like, no, it has a revitalization effort largely across all different pagan faiths. There are, even, in the Abrahamic religions, there are, what was it? Greek Orthodox. I think they incorporate some of the Greek pantheon into their worship of like Jesus and things. Yeah. So it's not as dead as you would think, and I think for a long, long time it hasn't been. But because pagans were so shunned, and because different belief systems overrode others, you weren't allowed to say these things until much more recent times, and actually be publicly out of the broom closet, as they say. Um, you couldn't do or say a lot of what you believed, and so many families. I think I forgot what this YouTuber's called, but there was a specific YouTuber that I was watching who is Norse pagan, or I don't think he's Norse pagan, I think he's just pagan, and he might follow a more Celtic path, but his family from his grandparents to his great grandparents have all been pagan, passing down things through the generations, and he grew up pagan, knowing his family history and lineage, but always being told that he couldn't talk about it. Now he talks about it openly on a YouTube channel, and I'm sure there's so many more families like that. And I mean, that's the literal reason we have a lot of pagan traditions inside of things like Christianity nowadays, because people had to hide their actual practices under the veil of one of the Abrahamic religions to be able to stay alive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like, oh, I'm not, dancing around the tree in the forest. It's a Christmas tree. That's what it is.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what it is. I mean, I've been friends with people who are druids, and that's another thing where like people are like druids. That's really ancient, and like it's not even real. It's fantasy. It's in fantasy novels. It's like, yeah, druids were real, and they are real. Like there are druids.
I mean, same thing with witchcraft. It's, being like practicing witchcraft in modern day and age too, and then having tons of people just use it willy-nilly as terminology in their books. And it's at this point, it's such a common phraseology that you can't take it back, you can't reclaim that term. And I write witches in my books too, so it's not like I'm like, oh, no one can write witches. However, it does, especially when you write stories where it's good, pure, heroine hero is corrupted by the filthy witch who follows a multi-god pantheon of demons. Then it's, I mean, she sounds like a badass, but people do get actively still like murdered and sued and different things like that for following, their religious beliefs in these different kind of the systems that are not the popular ones.
I One of my early memories from school, my parents and I are not like practicing of any specific religion, but if we lean towards anything, it's definitely a more like Wicca nature based approach. And we celebrate Christmas, but we more celebrate solstice. We just do it at Christmas time because it makes sense, that sort of thing. We listen to Celtic music all December, not like Christmas carols. Um, and when I was little, I like didn't know anything about Christian religions, anything like that. It was just, nothing, or we like witches, that sort of thing when I was like 5. And I went to school And I made my first friend, who I'm still friends with her to this day, and she would never say anything like this now, and she would probably cringe if she heard me even telling this. Uh, but she went to church every Sunday with her parents, and she was asking me once if I had been baptized. And I didn't even know what that was. I was like, no. And she just looks at me, and she's this very intense person. And as a child, she was very intense too. And she's got these like ice blue eyes, and she was taller than me. And she just looks me in the eye and she goes, "You're going to hell." And I was like, I got home and I was like, "Mom, what is that?" Like, just the trickle down of this kind of thing of like, oh, to your kid. And thing is, her parents weren't like heavily religious, but just because they had brought her into that environment where people were saying things, and who knows what she heard about paganism, about nature, about people who weren't baptized, you have her going to school and telling another kid they're going to hell, and like terrifying them. So there's a lot of there's a ripple effect there.
Yeah. Jeez. I've heard so many stories like that before.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just like traumatizing every time. Hey.
It is. And I have a terrible childhood memory, but that is definitely there.
You're like, if I remember one thing at all, it's that I'm going to hell.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Anna. New shirt. Thanks, Anna.
Just thanks, Anna.
And it's just like the flames of hell with like the Elmo in the middle. Oh, no. Everything's fine.
I want to do that now. we got to do Santa Odin and thanks, Anna.
Yes. Those are the 2 t-shirts for today.
T-shirts of the day.
I know we should do like a little pop-up of like t-shirts of the day.
Yeah, it would be cute.
Future
yes. One thing I just wanted to add, because I feel like this is kind of a rant episode for us, a ranting story episode. But before we started chatting, I did look up like a couple resources, and I found this now, like, I don't know where this school is from, so forgive me if it's like evil or something, but I don't know. It looks fine. It looks like a normal school. It looks all right. It's based in California. So it's a Menlo School, and they have this resource page that's all about world religions. And they link to like BBC on religions, Encyclopedia Mythica, Encyclopedia of Religion and Society, and just like a huge variety of different reference sites. And like it's a lot. And there are a few things like this. That's the best one that I found. But there's also a lot of talk where people discuss this book called Create a Religion in Your Spare Time for Fun and Profit. So I think there's a lot of fun stuff like where you can find different references. And religion is so fascinating. And we mentioned cults too. Obviously, cults are super fascinating to me anyway. I love the psychological element of them. I don't love them, but they fascinate me. And this stuff is so interesting to read. So like if you're a writer, it's worth looking through. It's worth learning the history, because this stuff is very interesting. I mean, it's you have thousands of people, in the case of religion, millions of people following this, doctrine. So there is something that you'll want to learn within that and get inspired by, I would think. So I wouldn't skimp on your religious reading. It might even be good if you're not building a hugely in-depth religion. It'll help to color your world in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and I usually find, and this is a broad statement, so take it for what you will, but my broad statement is that I usually find people who don't like world building, and specifically have the issue where they just take stereotypes and call it world building, is they also typically do not branch out of their very narrow view of the world. And if you get frustrated with the idea of researching other religions and other things like that, like that is part of the beauty of the world, is researching other cultures, other, ways of walks of life. Like I get so like, I'm getting an anthropology associate's degree next summer for fun, because I find researching
as a treat
to myself, just because I find this stuff so incredibly interesting, because I when I started traveling, when I started getting out of, my very narrow view of the world, I found so much beauty and so much just interesting, fascinating people and cultures. And it definitely improved my own writing just through the act of osmosis, of being around and learning different things from different people. And I think if you live your life totally closed off from every other person practicing a different religion or a different faith than you, or has a different worldview of the way that everything works, then everything just gets a little bit dimmer. And it's very sad, I find, when I find worlds that could be so lush and so beautiful when I'm reading them, but then they're missing some sort of spark because the story was clearly created inside of a vacuum. And unfortunately, when you live like that, you run the risk of perpetuating negative stereotypes about different types of people who would otherwise be your friends, be your colleagues, who are writing stories of their own. And if your story ends up doing the Stan Lee method of getting more popular than someone who actually has a lived experience inside of their faith, inside of their culture, then you're accidentally coloring other people's view of that person and of their way of life, and their story might not get as big as yours, or they're going to be, oh, you wrote it wrong because this other person did it this way. And I don't think that's fair to anybody, and I think that's a really sad existence to live in, where you don't have the ability or the willingness to go and learn and experience the lives of other people around you and connect with them on any sort of level.
Oh, so yeah, such a good point. As our anyone who has listened to previous episodes or follows any of my stuff knows, I've been traveling, and I was in Eastern Europe. Well, Europe in general, mostly sort of towards the eastern side through the summer. And I'm like a pretty introverted person. Doing that in the first place was like a big thing for me to do. But one of the places I wanted to go was Greece, and I've wanted to go there since I was 13, because in my upcoming fantasy epic that I'm working on, Sintera, one of my characters is from Greece. And the funny thing is, so far in this first book, she's only there for like 4 chapters or something. But I just knew that I wanted to get it right. And obviously this isn't something that everyone has the ability to do, right? Like not everyone can jet off to another country to learn about it. But if you are able to, it was so amazing to do that. Like I went to the island of Crete, which is like the most distant island in Greece, with all the islands that are there. And I was lucky enough to stay with this family who took me to one of their like festivals, and it was like from a different era. It was the most culturally different thing that I had done like ever, and it was so worth it. And like I was terrified to do it because it's like I don't know these people that well. They were super nice, but anything they invited me to while I was there, I said yes, unless I was working, because I was like, I have to just say yes. So I went, and I swam in the sea with them one day with their friends. And then I went to this festival, and they had me like up dancing in a circle, and they had the traditional instruments and stuff. And that was just like, it was priceless to be able to do that, to experience that. And now one of the things I was frustrated about when I was traveling was that I wasn't able to write that much while I was there. But I just told myself, like, settle, you are absorbing this, like you said, this osmosis. And now like that colors my mind while I'm writing, and I have that like in me now. And being able to pick up that sort of thing from other cultures is like one of the most beautiful parts of life. And if you can't go far flung, there are, there are going to be subsects of cultures and, religions and stuff like that in your own city or your own, where you live. You're going to be able to find something nearby that'll help you experience something different too. Like, look to indigenous cultures. Like here in Montreal, off the island, we have Ganawake, and like it's a whole sort of group of people who live there. You can go out, you can talk to them, they will tell you their stories, you can hang out, and as long as you're respectful and not treating these people like a stage show or something, then you can learn something about a different culture very close to home.
And I often find that's when you have the most colorful world building religions and cultures inside of your books, is when you're not just pulling from a singular source. If you're trying to make something that is not just inspired by a singular thing. I personally am of the beliefs as well that if you're going to be inspired so heavily that your entire book is based around one sort of culture, you should probably be from that culture, right? But if you're going okay, I'm going to go and learn as much as I can about as many different types of people and places as I can. And then I'm going to take everything that I learned to go and sit down and think critically about what my world actually needs. Because you can just also have religion and culture just be a set dressing because you think it's pretty. It can work and it could be good for some, good aesthetic purposes. But sometimes it just becomes unneeded filler in your world versus actually thinking about, okay, I have gone, culturally, either digitally or physically around the world. I've gone and looked on YouTube for some walkarounds of some of my favorite cities because I want to take from that architecture. I've sat down and listened to some beautiful tales of the creation stories of my local indigenous tribes. And I want to take a couple of the different elements that they have about nature from theirs, but then put it into the setting of like the channels of Italy where they have the boats that go between the different buildings. And I want to actually go and put that all inside of a setting where that religious belief system has started to die because now we're building tall buildings around the rivers, and the nature element that they believe in is actually part of the river systems, and now those are getting polluted, and that's part of the plot. Now you have something that's actually integral to the story. Now you have something that's super brand new, and it's not really taking or stealing from one specific source because you're understanding that you can't create things like world culture, world building, religion, cults, anything inside of a vacuum. It needs to all be able to play with the plot and the characters and has to be important to the story. And sure, if none of this is going to be important to your story in the long run, then cool, you don't necessarily have to do it. But for a lot of these large, you know, other world, especially fantasy novels, I find that usually that's the thing that I feel like is missing. Or even for some things that are like paranormal in a modern setting, I will feel like, oh, this is a really cool town. I wish that I would learn more about what these paranormal creatures are doing in this town and how the town interacts. And, how is the different, subsects of paranormal creatures? Do they all just believe in Christianity, or have, some of them stayed to the pagan roots in which their myths actually come from? I find that to be so much more of an interesting story than just saying that everything's set dressing or nothing exists and I'm not going to mention anything about the town, the location, the culture, or anything like that. And usually I find stories like that to be lacking some sort of depth and soul to it that other people who take the time to go and create the stories, that's what I gravitate towards. And then I usually find too that if you have this great world building, when it comes to these different things, you'll start finding spin-off stories and different tales that you want to give readers as snippets, and they'll start asking you for more knowledge and information about the world. And now you have readers actually asking you about your book, not you try to be like, please buy it, please buy it,
Yeah.
please buy it. Now
and,
you're asking
and that's
for more stories.
And that's one of the most fun things as an author too, once your world building takes off, because it can be like, sometimes you have that spark and you're just like, I'm going to get into this right now and I'm super excited to get going. But sometimes you have like the basic story in mind and you're like, okay, now I have to sit down and I have to like start this foundation. Like, oh, where am I going to start? But once you make that start and it gets going and it starts getting that momentum and sort of becoming its own thing, you're going to start writing and you'll like throw a type of character in. And as I was writing, I threw a sect in that I hadn't researched it yet or anything. Like I hadn't done any building and I still haven't. It's just very cursory. But I was like, oh, the Flame Tongue Fae. And like it just sounded cool, and I had this basic concept of them being like this deep sort of religious group of fae who have practiced their magic so hard that they can like walk on magma like in a volcano and stuff, and they harness fire, and they're very 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 intense. And I just had this concept, and it just started building into something, and then I made an island for them. And like as you write and as you do that bit of world building, these things are going to come up, and suddenly I'm like, this would be a whole cool thing to build a side novel on, and it will just like it'll snowball from that point once you start building.
Oh yeah, and I've been using currently the reference of fantasy, but this works and is true for science fiction as well. One of oftentimes the frustrating things that I see is people being like, well, in sci-fi, if you're in a space opera, so far in the future, people won't have religion anymore. I'm like, okay, we literally have paganism in every branch coming
It's
back.
2024. We still have it. I think it's going to keep going.
Yeah, like you can't go and take people's belief systems away from them just because of science. If anything, a lot of the times we end up having science proving things that magic was once the explanation for. Magic is literally just the science that we can't don't have the scientific terms for.
That's my explanation for ghosts, because I do the haunted channel and people will say, oh, do you believe in ghosts? I'm like, okay, I believe in something. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I'm not going to claim to know what it is, but I absolutely believe people have these experiences and there is something, and right now it's the paranormal, but eventually science is going to explain that. So I feel that absolutely that is going to be the same sort of thing with religious elements.
Well, I mean, every time someone asks me about those things, because I'm 100% a believer of ghosts and the paranormal and all of those different things, I always say that, like, even Einstein said that energy cannot be created or destroyed. We have a finite amount of energy that was created into the cosmos, and when we die, where does it go? That's, in turn, proof of some sort of afterlife system, as well as the proof that there very well could be ghosts, residual energy from people, different things like that. And you can't just blanket anything. You can't blanket anything. It exists.
Well,
It doesn't exist. It's science.
It's funny because that's a very atheist thing to say about science fiction, right? And when I was younger, I would call myself an atheist. I'm like, I would call myself agnostic at this point, because it's very non-scientific and very illogical to solidly just claim atheism. Like, and maybe unpopular opinion, but atheism in itself is religious in a way, because it's like a strong belief in non-belief. And I feel like that's where people are coming from when they're saying that sci-fi, that the inevitable thing for the intelligent evolved society is to not have religion. Like, you can be very intelligent and very evolved and have a religion. Some of the smartest people I know are religious.
Yeah, that 100%. And one of the main things I even world builded into my space opera saga, basically, that is currently on the back burner right now. But I started coming up with an idea for a spin-off of the book, and I was like, okay, I have these characters. How do they connect to the main story? What is going on here? And in essence, I'm going to try not to spoil this because this is like book 3 information. But there is a species that is monogendered, so they only have women, but it's not biologically that they only have women. It's because they kill all of their men after they're born, and they only keep the women around, and they can reproduce within just fellow females. They don't need men. And so I had this idea for this alien species that does this and has operated this way for hundreds of years. And I was always like, why do they do that, though? I needed like some sort of concrete reason why them as a society had moved to the point where they decided that this was the only way to do this. And one of the reasons why they didn't go and just, do an abortion or something like that before a male was born, or why they didn't scientifically alter, a fetus in the womb to be only female, was part of religious reasons about not, entering into the body of women, essentially in their culture, and in their religious beliefs, right? And then I was like, okay, well, why did they kill all the men? And it wasn't only through me figuring out this spinoff that I wanted to do, where there's this bad guy, and he is, in relation to that species. And I was like, okay, here is his, power set of what he can do that is special. And I connected that back through the men of that species. And I realized that the men of this species are sort of vampiric in nature. And so they're the only ones who have these sort of vampire-like nature in their species. So yes, space vampires. I'm very excited to work on this book.
I like that.
Next year.
I'm excited to read that.
Yeah. I'll after podcast, I'll tell you more about it. It's very fun. I'm very excited for it. But yeah, they're basically, space vampires, and that's why all the men get killed and murdered in that society. And so I was only able to go and figure out, though, this process of why this culture is the way that it is through, one, its religious connotations of the things that this culture believes, and then two, I had this inkling of world building that I had not fully fleshed out for the past 9 years that I've had this book in my head, and the 8 years that I was writing it and querying it. And I never filled in the blank, because I was like, you know what? I will find something that this holds a purpose for at some point in time. And it was not important for the main plot of Spaceborne, the book I was writing. I knew it would come up later where I had to figure it out, but I decided I'm going to leave this open-ended for now, where the main character doesn't have to know this knowledge. The reader might question why, but I will find it out eventually. And now that I have the spin-off book where the pieces fit together absolutely perfectly, I'm glad I left it open-ended so that I don't in my head go, oh, but I said it was this, or actually I mentioned in the book that it was this and I have to take it out. And that's one of the great things about world building, is that sometimes you will over world build and there'll be information that just doesn't make it into the book and people get to ask for it, right? I just had a beta who had asked me for a world Bible to be put in the beginning of the book for the Viking book I'm working on because they were so curious about the world and they wanted to know more information. So I gave it to them, and it's in the beginning of the serial that you can read now. Versus other times, there's going to be people who are like, okay, I don't need all of this world building if you just try to shove too much of it into your book. You, the author, need to know things that your reader might not, and things even that your main character might not. Like in Spaceborne, Soraya does not know about these vampire aliens. She just knows that this culture operates in this way, and she doesn't need to know more because at that time in book one, the reader doesn't need to know, and she doesn't need to know. But you, as the author, get to fill that out later on. You get to discover that for yourself. If a reader asks for it, you can just kind of be a little bit cheeky about it. But those are some of the beautiful aspects of world building, all of these different religions and cultures and different things like that. And you only get that if you're actually putting in the dedicated time to learning, researching, and developing your world in a meaningful and thought out way.
Because you are your book world's solo god.
Yes. You are actually the solo god of the universe that you're creating, and you get to decide everything.
No pressure.
No pressure.
So as we come up on our hour, I wanted to touch on cults very briefly because the thing that I think is interesting to say about cults that we can get into just a little bit is, so we talk about with religion how, you know, you don't want to misrepresent, you don't want to make things difficult for a community of people, you don't want to misunderstand them and, you know, be insulting and stuff like that. Now cults are like inherently negative, right? And so I think the thing to discuss when writing a cult is something that a lot of people don't think of, and that's survivors. Because with cults, you often think of them, and I've definitely thought this way when I was younger, that like, ooh, it's just this scary thing. Like it's this scary, weird thing, and people who joined were like sucked in or whatever, you know. And like with, you know, religion, how I say that there's plenty of people who are intelligent and religious, there are plenty of people who are intelligent who join cults. It depends what, you know, how charismatic the leader is and stuff like that. And there are a lot of cult survivors. I won't name names or anything, but I know someone, not directly, but it's a friend of a relative, who his job is to deprogram people from cults, and that has been his entire life's work. So there's enough work in that area that it's been someone's life work, and it's not like he's not the only person in the world who does that. So there are probably a lot more survivors of cults than you would even imagine. And I think that that's the important thing that we should touch on when writing cults.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it falls into that negative stereotype thing again, where like, yes, cults are inherently bad. But then, you know, whenever I see cults oftentimes depicted in some sort of fantastical, fictional way, it's typically in some sort of fantasy world where it's obvious that these are the bad guys and they're wearing dark red robes and doing human sacrifices. Like, if you're at that point of the cult like section, there was a lot to get you there, one, and two, that's typically not how the average cult operates. They put on the smile, they're very charismatic, they manipulate, they hold financial you know, a financial leash basically on their followers and different things like that. And one of the things I encourage anyone to do before they start writing any sort of cult is to go watch some real good actual true crime with modern victims about, you know, their experiences inside of different cults. I like Mile Higher podcast for this a lot because they often have victims speaking directly to you about their you know experiences, whether it's through previous interviews or they specifically are brought on for that podcast. I love their victims first approach to things, and I don't really like watching true crime where it's just here's some gory stuff for your enjoyment at someone else's pain and expense. I prefer to you know hear about what happened to people and how they overcame it and their story of victory, or their story of, hey, they need your help because this is not solved, or this is something negative that happened to somebody, but we can now learn from it and mourn this person who's now gone. And you know, I am very selective with the true crime that I do get, but I do recommend Mile Higher for that. And if you're going to write a cult, I would look at some of their cult stuff that they and their like sister podcast Lights Out have, where they're focusing on victim statements, where they're focusing on what led the cult leader to be the way that they are. Because if you're going to have a cult, that is probably going to be, the leader is going to be one of your bad guys. And that will give you a more nuanced stance on who your big bad is without just going human sacrifices.
Exactly.
And then you'll also see how, charismatic that they can be, how manipulative that they can be. And, I too will not go and name names or the specific cult, but I do know a couple people who grew up in a specific cult that some people say is not a cult. They left it and said it is. And, they had to learn that some things are just like that they grew up with are just not normal. And people who didn't have super negative experiences inside of cults, religions, cults, there's sometimes a fine line. They still have to go through some sort of deep programming to learn certain things are okay or they're not okay, or that was actually really weird that you went through that, or are you fine? And therapy, which might not be something that you in your fantasy world have. And that's going to cause obviously different things to the characters who went through what they went through inside your book.
Yeah, and like you said, some people might not even be fully aware of like the effects or what they went through, especially if they were like born in or raised in a cult setting or partially. Like I know someone who was talking to me about where they were when they were little. It's like, it was like this and this happened there. I'm like, is that like a commune or what? And they're like, well, when we left, we had to sneak out in the middle of the night and we weren't allowed back after. And I was like, that's a cult. And they're like, yeah, I guess so.
Not sure.
So there's a lot of different levels to cult, and it's another fascinating thing. And it is frustrating when you see a two-dimensional cult in a novel where, like you said, it's just, demons, hoods, blah, 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 people who are ignorant are pulled in. No, like the levels of psychology involved in a cult are wild.
Yeah. One of the things that I love and hate in the Dragon Age franchise for one of my favorite video games is that sometimes the cults are Red Hood, sacrifice, worship dragons. But then specifically in Dragon Age Inquisition, there is a cult who starts basically like worshiping you as the main character a little bit because of the magic that you have. And everyone is saying that you are sort of a religious symbol. And this obviously influenced the Viking book that I'm writing right now. And that could even be a caveat inside of my book, is whether or not there are part of a religion or whether or not they're part of a cult. It's up to the reader's interpretation. But inside of, Dragon Age Inquisition, it's basically a whole commune of people who, you as the player call them a cult. Your advisors call them a cult. They themselves do not. They're just like, we're a religious sect who believe in you and this thing over here. And they live in basically a giant abandoned castle all together. And they do a lot of communal things together. And you could very easily see, given the state of the world being horrific, why people would seek sanctuary with them in that point of time. And I don't blame them for being and doing as they are.
Yeah, like people who join cults, there's always a reason behind it. There's, a need for belonging or something to do with finances, like you mentioned, or, they fall in love with the leader and are looped into something, or they have trauma in their past that the leader can exploit. So I think that the most important thing when you are writing that sort of thing is to, focus on recovery and resilience and find kind of a balanced and ethical perspective. And a lot of the time when you say things like that, people think, well, that's boring. And it's definitely not. It's actually more interesting because you can dive into the psychological elements more and make it such a much more richer story.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the dangers of if you just go, I'm going to be lazy with it, throw shit at the wall and wait to see what sticks, then you're missing on a lot of the richness and the depth of a story that actually makes it super interesting. And when we emulate other authors or other mediums, we sometimes don't see all the research that they did put in to actually like ethically and, be very creative and unique with their story. And when an author doesn't do it themselves, it's kind of, you know, a little bit more obvious because they're just pulling shit or throwing shit at the wall, or they'll forget their own world, versus people who actually take a really methodical approach to creating and blending it with the plot and the characters and the belief systems and doing it in a respectful, interesting manner. I usually find that those are the stories that I just end up enjoying more, because in my head I can fully see how certain characters came to be the way that they are. I can go, that character makes sense for who they are because of the religious upbringing that they have. This character makes sense for the complete opposite way that they are because of their same exact experience that they had in a different religious setting or a different culture. And one of the things I'm so far, because I'm still writing the book, but so far I'm really, really proud of in the Viking book that I'm working on, and something that betas have been expressing a lot of enthusiasm with, is the fact that our main male character has a lot of religious trauma, from how he specifically grew up inside of the religious experience that he did have, and then versus the other, you know, female character that we see the perspective of, she's in a completely different religion, had, you know, a completely different upbringing, and even, and she from her perspective, she is witnessing the trauma that happened to him that he is now shrugging off and not internalizing and dealing with in a great way. And from her perspective, we can see her side of things where she's going, you do realize that's crazy, right? From his perspective, he's like, this is normal, this is what is expected, this is you know, a normal slice life. And then he is looking at her culture going, they do this, really? Is that like,
Yeah.
and it's a nice meeting between, you know, different cultures and religious practices and beliefs, and because you're getting both of their perspectives on the same matter but from viewing each other, it's a really, really interesting thing to play with, that if I wasn't doing dual point of view, if I wasn't doing a romance between people from varying different backgrounds, you wouldn't get from this world. But because you're seeing it in a specific story in a specific way, I had to know a lot more about both worlds, both religions, both upbringings, cultures, areas, climates, even, than someone else who's not writing that, or someone who's writing a story where both people are from similar backgrounds to each other. But the level of world building necessary really does change, and the level of insight into that world does change. But if you're not willing to put in the work for the type of story that you're writing, that's where I usually end up finding I have issues with the world that I'm reading.
Yeah, I think wrapping this up, the sort of takeaway is just that the effort is worth it. It doesn't have to feel like work. And I think we've said a similar thing before, and this applies so much just in writing and in every area of writing, that even if it seems like a lot and maybe you just want to get to that really fun scene you want to write and you want like a really cool image, building the backstory behind that image is going to be what makes your book something that people actually want to read, and that in the long run you're going to enjoy writing more. Because when I do sit down and I do like a big chunk of world building, and even if I'm getting sort of like tired with it, if I like it at one point and then I'm like sick of it, when I get to writing, then I'm so thankful for having all of that, and it makes everything just better.
I mean, that's one of the things too, is a lot of the times what I at least find that I mess up in is that if I create something within the world and then I'm writing parts that have to deal with that thing in the world, and I've already established it in my world Bible that it is this way, I feel like I can't change it. And like we said before, you are the god of your world. You can go and decide to change elements later on down the line that don't fit your story. You can go and decide that, hey, I actually want it to be this way instead. Or actually, I want to delete this entirely. You can totally do that. I prefer, in my way of writing, there's no good, like, there's no preferred way to write. Your preferred way to write is however you write. There's no best way. But I do prefer to over create and then just explain what is necessary, versus being in the middle of a writing sprint, only having 30 minutes and then going, fuck, I gotta come up with a name for this thing. How does this thing work? Because then I'll just end up in a rabbit hole doing some research when I was supposed to be doing sprints,
Yep.
and my friends are like, what's your word count? And I'll be like, -5 somehow.
Been there.
But thank you guys so much for listening. If you have any tips about world building or would like us to dive into other specific elements about world building or religions or other things like that, do leave them in the comments if you're on the YouTube version of the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening, for watching, and we'll see you next time.
See you later. Bye.